What makes something terrifying? Is it the unknown, lurking just out of reach? Or is it the familiar, twisted into something that defies comprehension? SCP-1471, a name that to most means nothing, exists at this crossroads. It is not a monster in the conventional sense. It doesn't hunt, stalk, or attack. It simply is, and that is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. Officially known as SCP-1471 and nicknamed MalO, this Euclid-class anomaly has eluded conventional containment methods. Why? Because it doesn't exist in the physical sense. It is a mobile application, a small 9.8 MB file that appears innocuous on the surface. But once downloaded, it becomes impossible to remove, its presence infecting not just devices, but the very perceptions of those who install it. The SCP Foundation's containment methods for SCP-1471 are a testament to the age we live in. Forget vaults, guards, or laser grids. This anomaly requires digital warfare. Foundation agents scour online application stores daily, searching for any trace of MalO version 1.0.0. When they find it, they deploy self-uploading malware to disable the app until it can be physically removed and the device destroyed. But the problem doesn't end there. SCP-1471 doesn't advertise itself. There are no flashy banners or intrusive ads. It simply appears, silent, unnoticed, and spreads. Imagine an app that bypasses approval processes, slipping past firewalls like a ghost through walls. The Foundation's best minds haven't figured out how it does this. And that's where the unease begins. How do you fight what you can't fully understand? Here's where things get interesting. Once SCP-1471 is installed, the app doesn't create shortcuts or notifications. It doesn't demand permissions or bombard you with updates. Instead, it starts sending you images. At first, these pictures are innocuous. Snapshots of familiar places like your favorite coffee shop or the park where you jog. But in every photo, there's something else. A figure. SCP-1471-A. It's always there. In the background, sometimes blurry, sometimes clear. A tall humanoid entity with the skeletal head of a wolf and blank milky eyes. Its black matted fur seems to absorb light, and its grin, that wide, toothy grin, is impossible to ignore. It doesn't move. It doesn't threaten. It just exists. After 48 hours, the photos change. Now, they depict places you've recently visited, and SCP-1471-A is always closer. By 72 hours, the app sends you real-time images. You, in your living room, with SCP-1471-A standing behind you. You, at your desk with its skeletal face reflected in your monitor. And then, at 90 hours, the app stops entirely. But by then, it doesn't need to send pictures anymore, because SCP-1471-A isn't in the photos. It's in your life. Peripheral vision, mirrors, shadows, it's there. Always. The SCP Foundation has cataloged numerous cases of individuals exposed to SCP-1471 for extended periods. Most report a sense of unease that evolves into resignation. SCP-1471-A never interacts directly, and it's not inherently hostile. But its constant presence erodes the mind, leaving victims paranoid and isolated. The Foundation's official stance is that SCP-1471-A is an entity of loneliness. It doesn't want to harm. It wants to connect. But like a stray dog with sharp teeth, its attempts at companionship often have unintended consequences. Here's where the irony hits. SCP-1471 is advertised, if you can call it that, as a cure for loneliness. Its App Store description reads like something out of a tech startup pitch. Never feel alone again. MalO is an exciting and interactive experience that keeps you engaged and intrigued. Absolutely no ADS. It's almost laughable. No ads, sure, but the trade-off is a ghostly stalker that won't leave your side. Talk about a free trial that costs too much. Maybe you're sitting there thinking, I'd never download some shady app like that. But would you really? In a world where loneliness is an epidemic and connection feels harder to find than ever. wouldn't you be tempted by the promise of something more? And that's SCP-1471's hook. It doesn't need to chase you. You come to it. What makes SCP-1471 terrifying isn't just the entity itself. It's what it represents. The risks we take for connection, the blind trust we place in technology, and the creeping fear that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. This brings us to a case study. One of the most extensive encounters with SCP-1471 ever documented. Casey wasn't looking for trouble. She was just another lonely soul in a big city, scrolling through her phone, looking for distractions. What happened next is a cautionary tale of curiosity, isolation, and the thin line between companionship and terror. Her story begins like this. Casey flicked through her phone with an absent-minded thumb, the dull hum of the subway in the background. It had been another uneventful day at her new job. Data entry wasn't exactly thrilling, but it paid the bills. The commute was long, and the isolation gnawed at her, especially since she'd moved to the city. A notification popped up. New app suggestion for you. MalO version 1.0.0. Free, no ads. Her brow furrowed. She didn't recall subscribing to app recommendations. She tapped the notification, curious. The app's description was peculiar. For the lonely. Never feel awkward or alone again. MalO is an exciting and interactive experience that keeps you engaged. Absolutely no ADS. No developer was listed, and it had no reviews. Casey hesitated. Her last breakup left her raw, and the idea of having anything to fill the silence in her apartment was tempting. She hit install before she could second-guess herself. Nothing happened. No icon appeared, no indication it was even installed. Casey shrugged and slid her phone into her bag as the subway screeched into her station. The next morning, Casey was jolted awake by the buzz of her phone. Bleary-eyed, she swiped it open and found an image message. The photo depicted the corner coffee shop she frequented, but it was off. Sitting on the bench in the background was a figure. Humanoid, tall, and unsettlingly still. Its head resembled a wolf's skull, with blank, milky eyes that seemed to stare right through her. Her stomach churned. "What the hell is this?" she muttered. She scanned the sender's information. Blank. No number, no name, just a string of random characters. She deleted the message and chalked it up to some prank. By lunch, she'd nearly forgotten about it until another buzz drew her attention. This time, it was a picture of the lobby of her office building. The same creature loomed in the background, leaning against the reception desk, its long claws grazing the surface. A shiver raced down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. Against her better judgment, she didn't block the sender. Over the next 2 days, the messages came like clockwork. Each photo captured places Casey had been. The grocery store, her gym, even the laundromat where she'd spent her Sunday evening. The figure SCP-1471A, though she didn't know it yet, was always there. Its presence was unnervingly consistent, yet it never moved or acted hostile. Casey confided in her coworker Liz during a coffee break. "It's probably just some weird marketing thing," Liz suggested, brushing a stray hair from her face. "Like augmented reality. They're always coming up with creepy stuff to go viral. Just delete it." "I would, but I can't even find the app. It's not on my phone anywhere." Liz frowned. "That's weird. Maybe do a factory reset." Casey nodded but didn't follow through. A morbid curiosity rooted her to the experience. The figure's milky eyes haunted her, but there was something almost sad about it. Like it was lonely. By the third night, she began seeing the figure in her periphery. It never lingered when she turned her head, but it was there. A reflection in the subway window. A shadow in the corner of her room. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The fourth morning started with another photo. This one was different. Taken from her own living room, it showed her asleep on the couch, her face illuminated by the glow of the TV. The creature loomed in the background, its bony fingers tracing the edge of the window. Panic set in. She bolted to the window and threw back the curtains, expecting something. But there was nothing outside but the usual cityscape. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, contemplating calling the police. "And say what? Some app is sending me creepy pictures?" she muttered. Instead, she called Liz. "You need to come over," Casey said, her voice tight with fear. "I think someone's watching me." Liz arrived within the hour, armed with coffee and skepticism. Together they pored over the photos. Liz's face grew pale as she examined the most recent one. "Casey, this thing's in every photo. How is that possible?" "I don't know. I thought it was just some creepy AI prank, but it's been in my apartment now. What do I do?" Liz's brows knitted together. We could go to the police, or maybe the Foundation." Casey frowned. "Foundation?" Liz hesitated. "It's just something I've read about online. They handle weird stuff like this. Supposedly. Supposedly isn't very comforting, Liz." The two women sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Casey's phone buzzed again. Another photo. This one was taken from Liz's car, parked outside Casey's building. The creature was in the back seat. They both turned to the window, staring at the car below. The street was empty. We need to leave," Liz whispered. Casey and Liz bolted from the apartment, their shoes echoing on the stairwell as they descended. Casey clutched her phone tightly, her thumb trembling over the screen. "Where are we even going?" Liz asked, her voice frantic. "Anywhere but here," Casey replied. "We can't stay in one place, not with that thing following us." The subway was their first stop. Casey figured the crowds and constant motion might make it harder for the creature to track her. As the train sped through the dark tunnels, she found herself glancing at every reflective surface. The windows, the polished metal poles, even the sheen of Liz's sunglasses. But there was no sign of it. Not yet. They sat in tense silence until Liz spoke up. "Casey, we need a plan. Running isn't going to work forever." Casey nodded, her fingers tightening around her phone. I think it's tied to this app. I've got to find someone who can help me get rid of it." Liz's eyes widened. "The Foundation? I wasn't kidding earlier. They're real. Well, sort of. I read about them online. If anyone can deal with this, it's them." Casey arched an eyebrow. "You want me to trust some shadowy organization you read about on the internet?" Liz shrugged. "Do you have a better idea?" After hours of searching forums and encrypted chat rooms, Liz found a supposed contact for the SCP Foundation. The email was vague, with no name attached, but it promised discretion. Casey hesitated before typing out a message. "To whom it may concern, my name is Casey. I think I've encountered something dangerous. A creature connected to a mobile app called MalO. It's been following me, appearing in photos and in real life. Please, if you know anything about this, I need help." She pressed send and waited. Minutes turned into hours as anxiety gnawed at her. Finally, a reply arrived. Subject, case accepted. "Ms. Casey, we are aware of the anomaly you described. It is designated SCP-1471. Please follow the attached instructions carefully to ensure your safety and allow for containment. SCP Foundation. Attached were directions to a remote location outside the city." Casey shared the email with Liz, who frowned. "This could be a trap," Liz said. "We're trusting someone we've never met." "Do we have another choice?" Casey asked. "If it's not real, we'll figure something else out. But if it is, maybe they can stop this." The rendezvous point was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The windows were boarded up, and graffiti covered the walls. Casey and Liz parked a block away and approached cautiously, Inside, they were met by two figures in tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks. One of them stepped forward. "Casey?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. She nodded. "That's me. Are you with the Foundation?" "Yes," he replied. "I'm Agent Harris, and this is Agent Lopez. We're here to assess the situation and contain SCP-1471. Let me see your phone." Casey handed it over reluctantly. Agent Harris inspected it before nodding to Lopez. "It's active. We need to move quickly." "What does that mean?" Casey asked, panic creeping into her voice. Harris glanced at her. "It means the entity is aware of you, and its influence is escalating. You've already reached the critical exposure threshold." "Critical threshold?" Liz repeated. "What happens now?" Lopez cut in. "It becomes a permanent fixture in her perception. She'll see it everywhere, reflections, shadows, even in broad daylight. We need to neutralize the app before it's too late." The agents escorted Casey and Liz to a secure facility hidden beneath the warehouse. The sterile, white-walled room was filled with monitors and equipment Casey couldn't begin to understand. Harris placed her phone on a table surrounded by strange devices. "This is a neutralization chamber. If we're successful, the app will be scrubbed from your device, and its connection to you severed." "And if you're not?" Casey asked. Harris's silence was answer enough. The process began with a low hum as the equipment powered on. Monitors displayed streams of code interspersed with eerie images of SCP-1471 Casey's heart pounded as the creature's image appeared on every screen, staring directly at her. "Stay calm," Lopez said. "It's trying to intimidate you." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a loud screech filled the room. The image of SCP-1471 grew larger on the monitors, its skeletal grin filling the screens. "It's resisting!" Harris shouted. "Hold the line!" Casey clutched Liz's arm, her nails digging in. The room felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. Then, with a final ear-splitting noise, the monitors went dark. The hum of the equipment died, and the room was silent. Harris inspected the phone, then nodded. "It's done, the app is gone." Casey exhaled, a wave of relief washing over her. But as they prepared to leave, she caught a glimpse of a reflection in the polished surface of the table. SCP-1471 stood there, watching. The drive home was silent. Casey stared out the car window, her reflection barely visible against the inky blackness outside. She couldn't stop thinking about the polished table in the facility and the unmistakable image of SCP-1471 watching her. Liz broke the silence. "Do you think it worked?" Casey hesitated. "Harris said the app was gone, but I don't know. I can still feel it, like it's nearby." Liz gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles whitening. "You've been through a lot. Maybe it's just paranoia." "Maybe," Casey murmured, though her gut told her otherwise. She turned her head toward Liz, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for everything. I don't know if I'd still be here without you." Liz offered a small smile. "We're in this together." The apartment was eerily quiet when Casey returned. Every creak of the floorboard seemed amplified, every shadow darker than it should be. She checked her phone compulsively, as if expecting another image to appear. But it remained blank. Casey stepped into her bedroom and froze. Her mirror reflected her, of course, but something was off. The corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally in the reflection, warping ever so slightly. She forced herself to approach it, her breath quickening with every step. "It's just your imagination," she whispered to herself. But when she reached out to touch the glass, her fingers met resistance. Not from the mirror, but from something cold and solid behind the surface. A skeletal grin appeared just faintly in the reflection. Casey stumbled back, her heart pounding. The image faded, leaving only her wide-eyed reflection staring back at her. Casey spent the next day researching SCP-1471 obsessively. Despite the Foundation's efforts to scrub information from the internet, fragments remained. She found stories of others who had encountered the entity, some who adjusted to its presence, others who didn't. She reached out to Agent Harris hoping for clarity. To her surprise, he answered on the first ring. "Casey," Harris said, his tone measured. "What's wrong?" "It's still here," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw it in my mirror last night. You said the app was gone." There was a long pause. "The app's connection to you was severed, but exposure to SCP-1471 can leave residual effects. For some, it's permanent." Her stomach dropped. "You mean I'm stuck with this thing?" "Not necessarily," Harris replied. "We're still studying its behavior. It's not hostile, Casey. It's more complicated than that." "Complicated? It's ruining my life." "I understand. We'll send someone to monitor your situation. In the meantime, avoid reflective surfaces as much as possible." Over the next few days, SCP-1471's appearances became more frequent. It lingered in windows, watched her from the reflection of her phone screen, and even appeared in puddles on the street. Casey's initial terror gave way to frustration. She found herself yelling at it, demanding it leave her alone, but the entity never responded. One night, as she sat on her couch, she noticed SCP-1471's silhouette in the TV's black screen. Instead of fear, she felt a strange pang of pity. Its milky eyes weren't threatening, they seemed almost sad. "What do you want?" she asked aloud. The entity tilted its head but remained silent. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw its clawed hand twitch, as if reaching out to her. Liz visited often, bringing food and trying to keep Casey's spirits up. But even she couldn't ignore the growing tension in the apartment. "You're letting it get to you," Liz said one evening, pacing the living room. "You can't talk to it. That's what it wants." "What if it's not dangerous?" Casey countered. "What if it's just lonely?" Liz stopped and stared at her. "Casey, you're human. It's not. Don't forget that." Casey sighed. She didn't have an answer. Deep down, she knew Liz was right. But every time she saw the entity, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than anyone understood. Driven by curiosity and desperation, Casey devised a plan. She set up a camera in her bedroom, aiming it at the mirror. If SCP-1471 was truly there, she wanted proof. The first night yielded nothing. The second, the same. On the third night, however, the camera's motion sensor triggered. Casey reviewed the footage the next morning with trembling hands. The video showed her sleeping soundly. Then around 3 a.m., the mirror darkened. SCP-1471's skeletal form emerged, its head tilting as it watched her. It didn't move closer or attempt to harm her. It simply observed. Casey's hands shook as she paused the video. She stared at the creature's unmoving form. "What are you?" she whispered. Casey replayed the footage countless times. Each viewing made her more certain that SCP-1471 wasn't just watching. It was waiting. For what? She couldn't say. But the way it tilted its head, as though studying her, sent a shiver down her spine. She needed answers. The next day, she called Agent Harris. "I have proof," she said without preamble. "Proof of what?" Harris asked, his tone sharp. "That it's still here. It's observing me. I set up a camera, and it caught the entity coming out of my mirror." Harris sighed. "Casey, we told you to avoid reflective surfaces. Every interaction strengthens its connection to you." "I didn't interact with it," she snapped. "I just watched." "Isn't that what you people do? Observe?" "This isn't the same," Harris said. "You're dealing with a cognitohazard. Every time you acknowledge it, it acknowledges you in return. You need to stop." Casey hung up, frustration boiling over. The Foundation had severed the app, but they couldn't sever her from the thing haunting her. And now, they were blaming her for wanting answers. The next encounter came unbidden. Casey was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when she saw it. SCP-1471 appeared in the reflection of the window over the sink. This time it moved. Slowly, its hand raised, clawed fingers tapping lightly against the glass. Her breath caught. She turned, expecting to see it standing behind her. But there was nothing there. When she looked back at the window, the reflection was empty. That night, she dreamt of the creature. It stood in her bedroom, its skeletal grin inches from her face. Its milky eyes seemed to plead with her, though for what, she couldn't understand. When she woke, she felt an overwhelming urge to speak to it. Liz stormed into the apartment the following morning, her face tight with worry. "I've been reading more about this thing," she said, dropping a stack of printed pages onto the coffee table. "You're making it worse, Casey. The more you engage, the stronger it gets." "I'm not engaging," Casey protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Really?" Liz snapped. "You've been talking to it, haven't you? Trying to understand it? That's exactly what it wants." Casey slumped onto the couch, guilt weighing her down. "It's not hostile," she murmured. "It's just there, watching, waiting. Maybe it wants something, but I don't think it's trying to hurt me." "That doesn't mean it won't," Liz said firmly. "Casey, you need to stop. Completely. No mirrors, no cameras, nothing. If you keep this up, you're going to cross a line you can't come back from." For a few days, Casey followed Liz's advice. She avoided reflections and kept herself busy with work. But the presence of SCP-1471 didn't wane. If anything, it grew stronger. Shadows seemed darker, the air heavier, and always, she felt its eyes on her. The breaking point came late one night. Unable to sleep, Casey found herself standing in front of her bathroom mirror. Her reflection stared back, weary and hollow-eyed. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. The mirror darkened. Slowly, SCP-1471 emerged, its skeletal grin faintly illuminated. For the first time, it moved closer, its clawed hand pressing against the glass. Casey's breath hitched as she reached out, her fingers trembling. The surface of the mirror was ice cold, but it gave way under her touch, rippling like water. She gasped and pulled back, but not before she felt the faintest pressure of its claw against her skin. The contact sent a shock through her body, and she stumbled back, her head spinning. The creature receded into the mirror, leaving her alone in the dim bathroom. But the sensation lingered, an icy reminder of the boundary she had just crossed. Casey called Agent Harris the next morning. Her voice was shaky as she recounted what had happened. "It touched me," she said, "through the mirror. I don't know what it means, but it's different now, closer." Harris's tone was grim. "You need to come back to the facility, immediately." "What are you going to do?" Casey asked, fear lacing her words. "We're going to try something more extreme," Harris said. "Pack a bag. We'll send a car." Casey hung up and began gathering her things. As she zipped her suitcase, she caught sight of her reflection in the TV screen. SCP-1471 was there, watching silently. This time, its skeletal grin seemed wider, almost triumphant. The car that arrived for Casey wasn't what she expected. A black SUV with tinted windows, its engine hummed with a barely audible purr. The driver, a stoic man in Foundation-issued gear, opened the door without a word. Casey slid in, clutching her bag tightly. The drive was long and silent, the city lights fading into the darkness of the countryside. Liz had wanted to come, but the Foundation had insisted on Casey traveling alone. She stared out the window, her reflection faintly visible. For once, SCP-1471 didn't appear. The absence was unsettling in its own way. Finally, they arrived at a nondescript building tucked away in a dense forest. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as two agents met her. Harris was one of them, his face as stern as she remembered. "Follow me," he said, leading her down a series of hallways into a sterile white room. In the center of the room was a chair surrounded by machines, their blinking lights and wires intimidating. "What is this?" Casey asked, her voice trembling. "A containment experiment," Harris replied. "We're going to sever your connection to SCP-1471 for good, but it's risky." "Risky how?" Harris exchanged a glance with the other agent. "This procedure hasn't been tested on anyone with your level of exposure. There's a chance it won't work. Worse, it could. Strengthen the connection." Casey's throat tightened. "What happens if we do nothing?" "Then SCP-1471 becomes a permanent presence in your life. It will escalate. The boundaries between your perception and its reality will blur." Casey swallowed hard and nodded. "Let's do it." Casey sat in the chair, her arms and legs strapped down. Electrodes were placed on her temples, and a monitor displayed her heart rate, which was spiking. "Stay calm," Harris said. "This will be over soon." The hum of the machines grew louder. A sharp, icy pain shot through Casey's skull as the equipment activated. She squeezed her eyes shut, but images of SCP-1471 flashed in her mind. Its skeletal grin, its milky eyes, the way it tilted its head. It was all there, amplified and vivid. The room around her seemed to dissolve. Casey found herself standing in an endless void. SCP-1471. A mere feet away. It didn't move. It didn't attack. It just stared. "What do you want?" Casey whispered. For the first time, it reacted. The creature's head tilted and it raised a clawed hand, pointing at her. Words formed in her mind, not spoken but felt. "You called me." Casey's breath hitched. "I didn't mean to. You saw me. You kept looking. You let me in." The void began to shift. The creature's form growing larger, more imposing. Casey felt herself being pulled back, her vision blurring as the real world began to reassert itself. Casey woke to find Harris and the other agent hovering over her. The machines were silent, and the room's fluorescent lights felt blindingly bright. "What happened?" she croaked. Harris's expression was grim. The connection wasn't severed. If anything, it's stronger now. SCP-1471 is anchored to you. We don't know how to fix this. Casey's stomach dropped. "So that's it? I'm stuck with it forever?" Harris didn't respond. His silence was answer enough. Weeks passed, and Casey tried to adjust. SCP-1471 was everywhere now. Reflections, shadows, even in her dreams. But it still didn't act hostile. It watched, it followed, but it didn't harm her. Liz visited often, though her concern was palpable. "You're handling this better than I thought," she said one evening. Casey shrugged. "What choice do I have? It's like having a weird roommate. Annoying but not dangerous." Liz frowned. "Just don't forget what Harris said. The boundaries are blurring. Be careful, okay?" One night, Casey's dreams took a darker turn. She found herself in the void again. SCP-1471. A closer than ever. Its milky eyes seemed to glow, and its skeletal grin widened unnaturally. "The time is near," the words echoed in her mind. Casey jolted awake, her heart racing. She checked her reflection in the window, half expecting to see the creature. But it wasn't there. Instead, scrawled across the glass in foggy letters, were the words, "Do not trust them." Casey stared, her pulse pounding. Was the warning meant for her, or against her? Casey couldn't shake the words written in the fog on her window. "Do not trust them." They lingered in her mind, casting doubt over everything the Foundation had told her. Who was them? Harris? The Foundation? Or was it a trick from SCP-1471? Liz's concerns echoed in her thoughts. Don't forget what Harris said. The boundaries are blurring. But what if they weren't blurring the way the Foundation thought? What if she wasn't losing herself, but seeing something they didn't want her to? Casey picked up her phone, debating whether to call Harris. Instead, she opened her browser and searched for anything she could find on SCP-1471 bypassing the layers of censorship. Buried deep in obscure forums and encrypted threads, she found stories, some eerily similar to her own. A common thread emerged. Those who interacted with the entity too much became targets of the Foundation. The posts hinted at cover-ups, disappearances, and experiments far beyond what Casey had endured. Her heart pounded as a chilling thought surfaced. What if the Foundation wasn't trying to protect me from SCP-1471 but protect themselves from me? The next morning, Casey received an unexpected call from Harris. "We're sending a team to your apartment," he said abruptly. "Pack what you need. You'll be staying at one of our secure facilities indefinitely." Casey's grip on the phone tightened. "Why? You said I was stable." "There's been a development," Harris said, his tone clipped. "This is for your safety. And ours." She knew better than to argue outright. "All right," she said. "When will they be here?" 2 hours, be ready." The line went dead. Casey's mind raced. 2 hours wasn't much time. If the Foundation was planning something, she had to act fast. Casey called Liz. "I think they're going to take me," she said, her voice trembling. "What? Why?" Liz asked, alarmed. "I don't know, but I don't trust them. I need your help." "What do you need?" Liz asked without hesitation. Casey explained her plan. It was risky, bordering on reckless. But Liz agreed. Within an hour, Liz arrived with her car idling at the curb. Casey climbed in with a hastily packed bag. As they drove away, Casey felt a pang of guilt. She didn't know what the Foundation would do when they found her gone, but the thought of returning to their sterile rooms and invasive procedures filled her with dread. Liz brought Casey to her cousin's cabin deep in the woods. It was isolated and off the grid, the perfect place to hide. For the first few days, they kept the lights low and avoided using electronics. But SCP-1471's presence didn't wane. If anything, it felt closer. One evening, as Casey stared into the cabin's cracked bathroom mirror, SCP-1471 appeared. Its skeletal grin and milky eyes were almost familiar now. This time, however, it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it raised its clawed hand and placed it against the glass. "What do you want?" Casey whispered, her voice barely audible. The creature's head tilted, and for the first time it spoke. The voice was faint, as though coming from a great distance. "You need to see." Casey's breath caught. "See what?" The creature didn't answer. Instead, the mirror darkened, and an image began to form. It showed a sterile room, much like the one Casey had been in at the Foundation. In the center was a chair, and strapped to it was Casey. Her own reflection, eyes wide with terror, stared back at her. She stumbled away from the mirror, shaking her head. "No, that's not possible." Liz found her moments later sitting on the floor, pale and trembling. "What happened?" Liz asked, kneeling beside her. Casey couldn't bring herself to explain. The next day, Casey decided she couldn't run forever. She needed answers. Against Liz's protests, she called Harris. "Where are you?" he demanded. "I'll come back," Casey said. "But I want the truth, all of it." Harris hesitated. "Fine, but if you run again, there won't be another chance," Casey agreed. Liz drove her to a prearranged meeting point, and within minutes, another black SUV pulled up. Harris emerged, flanked by 2 armed agents. "You're making the right choice," he said, though his expression betrayed no relief. As they drove back to the facility, Casey noticed something in the reflection of the car's tinted windows. SCP-1471 was there, its skeletal grin unwavering. But this time, its presence felt less like a threat and more like an ally. The Foundation facility loomed in the distance, its stark concrete walls a sharp contrast to the dense forest surrounding it. As the SUV pulled into the underground garage, Casey's anxiety mounted. Harris's silence throughout the drive did little to calm her nerves. Inside, she was led to a new room, larger than the last, filled with monitors and devices she didn't recognize. A team of researchers worked diligently, their murmurs filling the air. In the center of the room stood the same chair from her vision, its restraints ominously open. "Sit," Harris instructed. Casey hesitated. "You said you'd tell me the truth." "And I will," he replied. "But we need to run diagnostics first. You've been exposed to SCP-1471 longer than anyone. We need to understand its connection to you." Reluctantly, Casey complied. The restraints clicked into place, and the hum of the machines began. Images flashed on the monitors. Her apartment, Liz's cabin, the void where SCP-1471 lingered. "What is all this?" Casey demanded. "A timeline of your interactions with the entity," Harris explained. "We're mapping its influence on your perception." The images slowed, focusing on the moment Casey first saw the entity in her mirror. Then, the screen went dark. A single image appeared, the sterile room from her vision, with a second Casey strapped to the chair. Her doppelganger stared straight at her, lips moving silently. "What is this?" Casey asked, panic rising. "We don't know," Harris admitted, "but it's why we brought you back. SCP-1471 isn't just influencing your perception, it's creating something new." The room dimmed as SCP-1471's silhouette appeared on the largest monitor. Its skeletal grin seemed almost smug. The researchers exchanged nervous glances, but Harris remained stoic. "Casey," he said, "we've discovered that SCP-1471 doesn't just follow its subjects. It mirrors them, adapts to them, and in rare cases merges with them." "Merges?" Casey repeated, her voice barely audible. "It's why the app targeted you," Harris continued. "You weren't just a random user. Something about you, your mind, your patterns, made you a perfect host." Casey's chest tightened. Host for what? Before Harris could answer, the monitor flickered. SCP-1471 moved for the first time, stepping closer to the camera as if trying to breach the screen. The lights in the room dimmed further, and the air grew colder. The entity's voice echoed through the speakers, layered and distorted. "She called me. She sees me. She is me." Casey's vision blurred. Her reflection in the nearest monitor began to shift, her features distorting into something inhuman. She struggled against the restraints as fear overtook her. "Shut it down!" Harris barked. But the machines didn't respond. The room erupted into chaos as alarms blared. Casey's mind was a storm of images and sensations. She was back in the void, SCP-1471 standing before her. This time, she wasn't afraid. "Why me?" she asked. "You saw me," the entity replied. "You understood. They fear what they cannot control. But you welcomed me." The void began to dissolve, replaced by flashes of her memories. Her apartment, Liz's laughter, the cabin in the woods. SCP-1471. A's voice softened. "We are not enemies, we are one." Casey felt a warmth spread through her, the fear giving way to an odd sense of clarity. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the room, but everything was different. The monitors displayed static, and the researchers were gone. Harris stood frozen, his expression unreadable. "Casey?" he asked cautiously. She looked at her reflection in the darkened screen. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her features bore subtle traces of SCP-1471's influence. But she felt whole. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Harris didn't look convinced. "What happened?" "I saw the truth," Casey replied. "It's not here to hurt me. It never was." The Foundation released Casey under strict surveillance, but she knew they were only biding their time. Liz picked her up, relief flooding her face when she saw Casey. "Are you okay?" Liz asked. "Better than okay," Casey said, smiling faintly. I understand now. Over the following weeks, Casey adjusted to her new reality. SCP-1471 was always there, a constant shadow in her reflections, but it no longer felt like an intruder. It felt like a part of her. The Foundation continued to monitor her, but Casey stayed one step ahead. She knew they wouldn't stop until they had answers, but she also knew they couldn't take what she had become. One night, as she stared into the bathroom mirror, SCP-1471 appeared beside her. For the first time, she smiled at it. Let's show them, she whispered. The entity tilted its head, its skeletal grin widening. The story of SCP-1471 doesn't end with Casey. Its lore has sparked countless fan theories and discussions, ranging from its true nature to its connection with human psychology. Some fans speculate that SCP-1471 isn't malevolent, but misunderstood a reflection of our deepest fears of isolation and the lengths we'll go to for connection. Others believe it represents the darker side of technology, a warning about the unintended consequences of our reliance on digital interaction. One theory suggests that SCP-1471's presence becomes more tolerable over time because it mirrors the subject's own loneliness. It doesn't harm because it is the subject, a manifestation of their psyche rather than an external threat. From a psychological perspective, SCP-1471 could symbolize unresolved trauma or repressed emotions, taking form as a constant reminder that these feelings need to be addressed. The Foundation's interventions, then, might not be about protecting individuals from harm, but preventing the larger implications of what happens when people confront such deeply ingrained fears. On a deeper level, SCP-1471 challenges the boundaries of perception and reality. By blending the digital and the physical, it forces us to question the nature of existence. If something exists only because we perceive it, does that make it any less real? The Foundation's efforts to contain SCP-1471 highlight their own uncertainty. They're not fighting a monster, but an idea, a concept that grows stronger with each interaction. Ultimately, SCP-1471 isn't just a story about a creepy app. It's a reflection of our fears, our desires, and the ways technology has reshaped human connection. Whether you see it as a warning or a mirror, one thing is clear. SCP-1471 is a story that stays with you long after the app is deleted.